I was standing behind my father on a bridge over the Shenandoah River, my hands 6 inches from his back, and I was going to push him. Not from rage, not from a momentary loss of control. From a plan I had built carefully over 4 months. A plan that had its own logic, its own arithmetic, its own internal justification, and that had brought me to that exact spot on that exact afternoon with that exact intention. I had told him I wanted to show him something beautiful. I had driven him there myself. I had positioned myself behind him at the railing. And what stopped my hands from completing what I had come there to do was not a change of heart, and not a sudden attack of conscience, and not any wisdom I had developed on my own. It was a presence on the other end of that bridge, a figure I could not explain, a man whose eyes I could not look away from. A look that did not accuse me or condemn me, but that showed me myself so completely and so honestly that my hands fell and my knees went, and I understood, in a single moment of total clarity, exactly what I had become. I want to tell you this story from the beginning, because the beginning is the only way the ending makes sense. And the beginning is not the bridge. The beginning is a farmhouse in the Shenandoah Valley, and a woman named Ruth Levine, and the specific quality of her death, and what her death did to a man I had loved my entire life, and what that man's response to the death did to me. But before I tell you any of it, leave a comment right now telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. I want to see how far this story is reaching today. My name is Sarah Levine. I am 38 years old. I grew up in Woodstock, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley, on a farm that my family had worked for 3 generations. My father, David Levine, was a cattle and hay farmer, 3rd generation, a man who had spent his entire life learning the specific language of that land, and who spoke it with the fluency of someone who had never considered any other dialect. My mother, Ruth, was a schoolteacher and a gardener, and the kind of woman who organized the Shenandoah Valley Jewish community's annual harvest gathering for 22 years without missing a single one, who knew everyone's name and everyone's grandmother's name, and who made people feel seen in the specific way that only certain people are capable of. We were a Jewish family in a rural Christian county, which was its own kind of particular existence. I want to say something about this that is not the simplified version, because the simplified version, which is that we were different, and sometimes it was hard, does not do justice to the actual texture of growing up Jewish in the Shenandoah Valley. It was not hard, mostly. It was particular, which is different. We knew who we were, and we were not apologetic about it, and our neighbors, by and large, accepted us with the specific neighborliness of rural communities where what matters most is whether you show up when someone needs a hand, and whether you are honest in your dealings, and whether you take care of your land. We met those standards. The Levine family had been meeting those standards for 3 generations, and the community understood what we were. There were occasional things, not hostile but clumsy. The neighbor who invited us to his church without quite understanding why we would not come. The county official who wished us Merry Christmas with the well-meaning incomprehension of someone who had not thought about what the words assumed. But these were the ordinary frictions of difference in a place that was mostly generous and mostly good. What I absorbed from growing up in that particular existence was something I have been grateful for since the bridge. I absorbed the understanding that faith is not uniform, that the people in the valley around us held their Christianity in different ways and to different depths, and with different qualities of genuineness, and that the quality of the person was not determined by the creed on the Sunday program. I had grown up watching people who believed in Jesus live the results of that belief, in ways that ranged from magnificent to ordinary, to occasionally hypocritical, the full range of what faith produces in actual human beings, which is not a simple picture but an honest one. When I came to the Gospels after the bridge, I was not coming to them as someone who had to first dismantle a wall of suspicion. I was coming to them as someone who had spent her life watching what the faith they described produced in people, and who had seen enough of the genuine results to know that there was something real in it, even before I knew it from the inside. We were a Jewish family in a rural Christian county, which was its own kind of particular existence. not hostile, not embattled, but distinct. We observed Shabbat on Friday evenings with candles and wine, and the specific quality of quietness that the farm had on Friday nights when my father came in from the fields and changed out of his work clothes and sat at the table and was simply present, not farming, not planning, present. We observed the high holidays. My mother kept a kosher kitchen with the relaxed practicality of a woman who believed in the form of it rather than the letter of it. We knew we were different from most of our neighbors, and we wore that difference without apology and mostly without friction. My relationship to God was the relationship of a person raised in a tradition who has absorbed the tradition without fully inhabiting it. I want to be honest about this, because it matters for what happened on the bridge. The Jewish tradition I grew up in was alive and real in our household. My mother made it alive. She did not simply observe the holidays and maintain the forms. She understood the forms and loved them, and could explain why they were what they were, and what they were pointing toward, which is the difference between someone who carries a tradition and someone who inherited the cultural furniture of a tradition and has not yet decided what to do with it. I was the second kind. My mother was the first kind. I had absorbed everything she offered and had not done much with the absorption. My father was somewhere in between. He was a man who had been raised in a Jewish household, who had married a Jewish woman, who had given his children a Jewish upbringing, and who prayed on the high holidays with a sincerity I could see and did not understand how to access in myself. He was also a man of the land in the specific way of farmers, which is to say, his deepest theology was the theology of seasons and soil and the specific patience that agricultural work teaches. The patience of a person who plants something and waits, who does not control the rain, who accepts that the outcome of his best effort is partly beyond him. The theology ran deeper in him than any formal expression of faith I had witnessed from him. It was in his body. It was in the way he walked the fields. I had absorbed that too, along with everything else he had given me, without knowing I was absorbing it. My relationship to God was the relationship of a person raised in a tradition who has absorbed the tradition without fully inhabiting it. I believed in the existence of God in the same unexamined way that I believed in the existence of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Both were there. Both were real. Neither required me to think carefully about what I believed about them on any given Tuesday morning. I did not pray regularly. I attended services on Yom Kippur with the specific combination of obligation and genuine feeling that characterizes the observance of people who are culturally and emotionally connected to a tradition without being theologically committed to it. I lit Hanukkah candles every year and felt something real when I did it. That was the extent of my religious life. What I was fully committed to, what I inhabited with the totality of my selfhood, was the farm. I had gone to Virginia Tech for an agriculture degree and had come back to Woodstock at 22 and had spent 16 years working the land beside my father and learning what he knew and developing my own knowledge alongside his and building a vision for what the Levine farm could become that incorporated everything he had built and took it further. We had bought the adjacent property in 2018 and expanded the cattle operation. We had added a direct-to-consumer beef program that served restaurants in Washington and Richmond. We had put in a hay operation that supplied 3 counties. The farm was not a sentimental attachment for me. It was my life's work. It was the thing I was made for in the specific way that some people are made for the thing they do, where the match between the person and the work is so complete that you cannot say which one shaped the other. My mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in March 2021. I need to tell you about her death more specifically than I have, because the quality of her death shaped what happened afterward in ways that I did not understand until long after. My mother died the way she had lived, which was paying attention to the people around her. She spent her last 3 months at home with my father, and with me. And she used those months the way she used everything, which was with intention. She had conversations with each of us that were different from the ordinary conversations of a life, that had the quality of someone who knew she was saying things for the last time, and had chosen to say them while she still could. She told me things about the farm, and about my father, and about what she hoped for my life, that I have returned to many times since. She told me that I had her tendency to hold things too tightly, and that I needed to practice open hands. A phrase she used, open hands, which I did not fully understand at the time, and which I understand now. She did not tell me about Patricia. I understand why. She could not have known that my father would meet Patricia at a grief support group 14 months after her death. What she could have known was that he would love again if he was given the opportunity, because she knew him. And what she said to him about Patricia, when she met her at that final harvest gathering, was the expression of that knowledge, her specific and generous attempt to release him into whatever came next. I did not know she had done this. For 2 years, I organized my interior life around the conviction that my father's remarriage was a betrayal of my mother, and for 2 years the truth was that my mother had blessed it. My mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in March 2021. She died in September of that same year, 6 months from diagnosis to death, which is the specific cruelty of aggressive ovarian cancer, that it does not give you time. She was 64 years old. She had been married to my father for 41 years. She had been the center of our family in the way that certain people are the center of their families, not by authority or by demanding it, but by the specific quality of their presence, which organizes the people around them without anyone consciously organizing around it. When she died, the center was gone, and the thing that had been organized around it began, slowly and then faster, to change shape. My father grieved. Of course he grieved. He had loved my mother for 41 years with the specific and unglamorous love of two people who have built a life together, who have disagreed and compromised and shown up and failed and tried again, and kept choosing each other through all of it. His grief was not performative and it was not brief. He walked the fields in the evenings the way he had always walked them, but differently, with the quality of a man who is going somewhere and arriving somewhere, and finding that the somewhere is empty. I watched him. I worried about him. I drove out to the farm from my house in town every day for the first month to check on him and make dinner and sit with him in the kitchen in the evenings. Before we go further into the marriage and what it did to me, I need to tell you about the specific quality of my connection to the farm, because without understanding that connection, the grief cannot be fully understood. And without understanding the grief, the obsession cannot be fully understood. I had been on that land since before I could walk. My earliest memories are of being carried on my father's back, through the hayfields, which is a particular kind of early childhood memory, the kind that goes into the body rather than the mind, the kind that you do not remember so much as recognize when you return to it, as if the memory lives in the soil and the smell and the specific quality of late afternoon light on the Shenandoah Valley hills, rather than in the neural architecture of your recollection. I grew up learning the land the way you learn a language when you are too young to know you are learning it, which is completely and without effort, and without the separation between the self and the thing being learned that comes later. By the time I was in my 20s and had come back from Virginia Tech with my agriculture degree, the farm was not a place I worked. It was the place I was. The distinction sounds sentimental until you have experienced it, and then it sounds like the most precise description available. Every season I had a knowledge of that land that was also a knowledge of myself. The hay going down in June was my July. The cattle through the summer pastures was my August. The specific quality of worry that comes with a dry September was something I felt in my chest before I checked the forecast. I was, in the way that farmers who love their land are, a person whose identity was organized around a place rather than around a set of qualities that could exist anywhere. My mother had loved the farm in a different way. Her love was the love of someone who had married into the land rather than been born to it, who had found in it a beauty that she was able to see because she was seeing it with the slight distance of someone who had not always known it. She made the garden the way an artist makes a garden, with attention to color and composition and the specific pleasure of things growing where she had placed them. She walked the fields on Sunday evenings in a way that was meditative rather than productive, pausing at the fence lines to look at the ridges, receiving the landscape. Her relationship to the farm was devotional in a way that my father's and mine were not, because ours was too intimate for devotion. You do not devote yourself to the air you breathe. When she died, the farm held all of that. Every corner of it held something she had touched or looked at or found beautiful. The garden held her completely. The farmhouse held her. The kitchen window she looked out of every morning held her. And when my father married Patricia, and Patricia moved into the farmhouse and began to tend the garden, the thing I experienced was not Patricia in a garden. It was Patricia and my mother. I want to tell you about Patricia now, because Patricia is the hinge of this entire story, and I have to tell you about her honestly, including the parts that make me look like what I was, which was not a protective daughter, but a woman who had confused possession with love and control with care. Patricia Hollis was a widow from Front Royal. She was 61 years old, a retired pharmacist, a grandmother of 3. She had met my father at a grief support group at the Woodstock Community Center that my father had been attending since November 2021, 2 months after my mother died. She was kind and steady and practical, and she had a quality of calm attention when she listened to people that I can recognize now, with the perspective I have developed since the bridge, as the quality of a genuinely good person. She and my father had been attending the same group for 3 months before they went for coffee. They had been going for coffee for 2 months before they told me. My father told me in February 2022, 5 months after my mother's death, that he had been spending time with someone, and that he cared about her, and that he wanted me to meet her. I want to describe what happened inside me when he said that, because the interior event of it is important for understanding everything that followed. I did not feel simple anger. I felt something more specific and more violent, a rupturing of a framework that I had not known I was maintaining, but that had been the structure of my daily understanding of the world, which was that my father and my mother were a unit, that the unit was permanent, that the farm was the physical embodiment of that unit, and that I was the heir of the unit in both its physical and emotional dimensions. What he was telling me by telling me about Patricia was not that he had found comfort. What I heard, in the specific distortion of grief and attachment, and a complicated inheritance of possession, was that the unit was being dissolved, that the permanence was being revoked, that the thing I had spent my adult life building my identity around was being given away. I said the right things when he told me. I said I was glad he was not alone. I said I looked forward to meeting her. I drove home, and I sat in my truck in my driveway for 45 minutes, and I felt something very cold settle into the place where the rupture was. I met Patricia in March. She was warm. She was considerate. She brought food to the meeting, and she asked me questions about the farm with genuine interest, and she did not try too hard, and she did not back away, and I could not find anything wrong with her, which made me angrier than finding something wrong would have. They were engaged in August, 8 months after my mother's death. I want to be honest about the timeline because the timeline is one of the things I used to build my case, in my own mind and eventually to other people, against Patricia and against my father's judgment. 8 months felt too soon. I said this to my father. I said it carefully, the way you say things carefully to parents you respect, with the appropriate framing of concern and the appropriate disclaimers about wanting his happiness. He listened. He said he understood I was still grieving. He said that being with Patricia did not diminish what he had with my mother, and that my mother would have wanted him to have companionship. He said he was 67 years old, and he had loved and lost, and he knew what love was when it was in front of him. I drove home from that conversation, and the cold thing that had been in me since February settled deeper. They married in October 2022, 13 months after my mother's death. I was at the wedding. I stood in the photograph. I shook Patricia's children's hands, and I smiled with my mouth, and my eyes were somewhere else entirely. What happened over the following 1.5 years is the part of this story that I have the most difficulty telling, because it requires me to describe a person I do not fully recognize as myself, and whom I am responsible for being. I became obsessed with the inheritance. That is the accurate word. I want to describe the obsession, honestly, because I think the honest description of how a person arrives at the unthinkable is more useful than a version that makes the arrival seem sudden or inexplicable. It was not sudden, and it was not inexplicable. It was a process with its own internal logic, a process that started with something real, which was grief and loss, and the specific pain of watching a person you love move forward from something that you have not yet moved forward from, and that went somewhere terrible by following that logic one step at a time, without ever stepping back to evaluate the full direction of travel. The grief for my mother was real. I want to say that clearly before I describe what the grief became, because the grief itself was not the problem. The grief was appropriate and proportionate, and the natural response of a daughter who had lost a mother she loved, and who had not processed that loss in any way that actually addressed it. I had worked through the loss the way I worked through most difficult things in my life, which was by staying operational. I showed up to the farm. I showed up to the work. I made myself useful. I was the daughter who managed the practical dimensions of the estate, and the logistics of the funeral, and the administrative aftermath of a death, which are substantial, and which gave me something to do with the energy that grief produces when it has no other outlet. I was functional. I was not grieving. The grief was in there, fully present and fully unaddressed, and it was going to find a container. Patricia was the container it found. I became obsessed with the inheritance. That is the accurate word. I did not drift into it, or slide into it, or find myself in it, without understanding how I had gotten there. I chose it, repeatedly, in the specific way that people choose the thing that gives their pain a direction and an object and a sense of agency. The inheritance was the thing I could do something about. The grief was not. The loss of my mother was not. The remarriage was not. But the inheritance was a problem I could work on. I consulted a lawyer. I researched the property law of Virginia as it applied to surviving spouses and to children of prior marriages. I learned about the specific vulnerabilities of estates in cases where a surviving spouse married quickly and where the children of the deceased parent had both emotional and financial stakes in the outcome. I kept records. I documented. I looked for evidence of what I told myself was undue influence. Patricia steering my father away from his original intentions for the property. I convinced myself, in the specific way that obsessed minds convince themselves, that what I was doing was protecting my mother's legacy and my father's best interests, and the farm that 3 generations of Levines had built with their hands. I was not protecting any of those things. I was feeding a hunger that had nothing to do with the farm, and everything to do with the specific wound of losing my mother, and watching my father replace her, as I experienced it, with someone who would inherit what my mother had helped to build. The farm was everything in that wound. I want you to understand this. The farm was not a financial asset to me. It was my mother's garden, and my father's hands, and the fields I had learned to read as a child, and the specific smell of the Shenandoah Valley in October, and the work that had organized my entire adult life. When I thought about Patricia living in that farmhouse after my father died, I felt something in my chest that I can only describe as the physical sensation of theft. I began to do things I cannot fully explain or excuse. I monitored my father's legal documents. I intercepted a revised will that he had asked his attorney to draft, not by stealing it, but by asking questions and noting the changes and understanding what they meant for the division of the property. I had conversations with my father's attorney that were not dishonest exactly, but that were shaped by an agenda I was not disclosing. I said things to my father about Patricia that were not lies exactly, but that were shaped and selected and delivered at moments of vulnerability to produce a particular effect. I was not crude about it. I was a woman who had grown up watching her father manage complicated negotiations with difficult neighbors and difficult markets, who had learned from him how to make a case with patience and evidence and the right sequence of information. I used everything I had learned from him against him. The marriage held. My father loved Patricia, and Patricia loved my father, and the marriage held against everything I did to strain it, which told me something I was not ready to hear, which was that what they had was real. The plan took its shape in late summer of 2024. I am going to tell you this plainly because plainness is what honesty requires. I had been in a state of sustained and intensifying obsession for 2 years. I was sleeping badly. I was drinking more than I should. I had alienated 2 close friendships with the specific thoroughness of a person who is consumed by something that is taking up all available space. My work on the farm was the one area where I still functioned well, because the farm was the object of the obsession and proximity to the object kept me operational. My father was 69 years old. He was in good health, but he had the health of a 69-year-old farmer, which meant joints that had been worn by decades of physical work, and a heart that had been monitored since a mild arrhythmia was discovered in 2021. He was not fragile, but he was not young. I told myself many things about what I was planning. I told myself that the river was deep at that point, that the current was strong, that an accident there would be plausible, and would be investigated and would reveal nothing. I told myself that my father had lived a full life. I told myself that what Patricia would receive from his estate was not rightfully hers, and that preventing that transfer was a form of justice. I told myself these things the way a person tells themselves things when they are trying to silence the part of them that knows the truth, which in my case was that what I was planning was the murder of my father. I drove him there on a Sunday afternoon in September. I told him I wanted to show him the old fishing spot on the Shenandoah, the place where he had taken me as a child, where his own father had taken him. He was pleased. He talked about those trips on the drive there, the way fathers talk about the past when the past is being offered to them as a gift. I drove with my hands steady on the wheel and my jaw set, and the cold thing that had been in me for 2 years settled into something very specific and very decided. We parked and walked to the bridge. It was a wooden footbridge, old, used mostly by hikers, over a section of the Shenandoah where the water ran fast over rocks. My father walked ahead of me. He was wearing the barn jacket he had worn for 20 years, the canvas one with the tear in the left pocket that my mother had sewed up 3 times. He leaned on the railing and looked at the water, and said something about the light, the way September light hits the Shenandoah in the late afternoon, which he had said something about every September of my life. I positioned myself behind him. I want to tell you about the moment before I tell you about the presence, because the moment itself is important. I was standing behind my father on that bridge, with my hands 6 inches from his back, and I was aware of what I was doing with a clarity I cannot fully explain. The clarity of someone who has been in a state of sustained unreality for 2 years, and who has, for a single moment, stepped outside it and seen it from the outside. I saw myself. I saw the barn jacket. I saw the 20 years of that jacket, and the tear my mother had sewed, and my father's hands on the railing. The hands I had watched work that land since I was old enough to walk behind him. I saw all of it with the total clarity of a woman who knows exactly where she is and what she is about to do. And then I saw the figure on the other end of the bridge. I want to describe this accurately, and without inflation, because inflation would be a disservice to what actually happened. I have given this account many times since September 2024, to Anna and to my father, and to the congregation of the small Mennonite church, and to others, and the temptation in each retelling has been to make it more dramatic than it was, to add the elements that make the experience more recognizable as a vision or a supernatural encounter. Because dramatic visions have a framework, and what I experienced does not fit neatly into any framework I have. What I am giving you is the accurate account, not the inflated one. The figure was a man. He was at the far end of the bridge. He was wearing simple clothes. The afternoon light was behind him, in the way that September afternoon light on the Shenandoah is behind everything that stands to the west, which means he was in the light, rather than the light being in him. He was not floating. He was not surrounded by radiance. He was standing on the bridge the way a person stands on a bridge. The quality of attention in his face was the only thing that was not ordinary about what I saw, and that quality was so specific and so unlike anything I had encountered in any human face that it stopped my hands more completely than any physical intervention could have. I have spent months trying to find language for it, and the closest I have come is this. It was the look of someone who was seeing me as I had been made to be, rather than as I had made myself, and who was showing me the gap between those two things with a love so complete that the showing was not a wound, but a gift. I want to describe this accurately and without inflation, because inflation would be a disservice to what actually happened. The figure was a man. He was standing at the far end of the bridge, perhaps 15 meters away, in the specific afternoon light of the Shenandoah Valley in September. He was not large or imposing. He was not surrounded by light in the dramatic sense that I had read about in accounts of visions. He was simply there, in a way that was unremarkable in every visual attribute except one, which was that he was looking at me with a quality of attention that I had never encountered in any human face. It was not judgment. I want to be clear about this because judgment would have been easier. Judgment has a distance in it, the distance of a person who has assessed you and found you wanting, and is delivering the finding from the removed position of someone who is not personally invested in the outcome. What I saw in that face was not removed. It was the opposite of removed. It was the most present attention I have ever been the object of. It was attention that knew me completely, not the version of me I had been maintaining for 2 years, not the version shaped by obsession and grief and the specific distorted logic of a person who has talked themselves into the unthinkable. The version underneath all of that, the version that had been there before any of it. It was the look of someone who loved the person they were looking at and was in pain because of what they were seeing that person about to do. My hands fell, not because I decided to lower them, because the muscles that had been holding them ready simply lost the tension that had been sustaining them for the last 2 years, and they fell, and my knees buckled, and I went down on the wood of that bridge the way you go down, when something structural in you has given way, all at once, with no warning. I did not look at the figure again after I went down. I could not. I was looking at the wood of the bridge, and I was making sounds I had not made since my mother died, the specific sounds of a person who has had something enormous removed from them very quickly, and what had been removed was the version of myself I had been inhabiting for 2 years, the version that had a plan and a justification and a cold, settled logic, and what was left without it was grief so total and so long unaddressed that it had no shape except the shape it made coming out of me on that bridge. My father did not understand what was happening. He turned when I went down, and he saw me on the wood, and he came to me with the movement of a man who does not move quickly anymore, but who moves with total urgency, regardless of speed. And he crouched beside me on the bridge, and he put his hand on my back, and he said my name, the way he had said it my entire life, which was the way you say the name of someone you love when they are in a bad place, and you are with them in it. He held me on that bridge for a long time. He did not ask me what was wrong. He did not need to ask. He had always known, in the specific way of parents who have watched their children for decades, that I had not been all right for a long time. He had not known the specific shape of how not all right I had been. He held me on that bridge and said nothing, and that holding was itself a revelation, because the thing I had been planning to end was the thing that was sustaining me in the worst moment I had ever been in. I told him on the drive home. Not everything. Not then. I told him I had not been handling his remarriage well. I told him that I had been doing things I was ashamed of, things to try to protect the farm and the inheritance, that I had let it become an obsession. I told him I was sorry. I was crying while I told him, and he was looking at the road, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something I have thought about every day since. He said, "Sarah, your mother loved Patricia when she met her once. She would have been glad for me." I did not understand this immediately. I said, "What do you mean she met her?" He said, "Patricia was at your mother's farewell gathering, the last one your mother organized, in September before she got too sick. They spent an hour together. Your mother told me afterward that she was exactly the kind of person she hoped I would find if she went first. I drove the rest of the way home without speaking. My mother had met Patricia, and had said she hoped my father would find someone like her. and I had spent 2 years trying to destroy what my mother had in some sense blessed. I want to tell you about what happened in the car on the way home from the bridge, because the car ride was its own event before I could get to the weeks. My father did not understand what had happened on the bridge. He had seen me collapse and weep, and he had held me. And now he was driving home because I was not in a condition to drive, and we were on the rural road that ran along the river, and the light was the September light that my father had been noticing all his life. He drove, and he was quiet in the specific way of a man who understands that quiet is what the situation requires, and that questions can come later. Halfway home, I said, "Dad." He said, "I'm here." I said, "I have not been well for a long time." He said, "I know." Just those 2 words, "I know," which was its own kind of absolution, because it meant that the thing I had been managing and concealing and organizing around the pretense of his best interests had been visible to him, and he had been patient with it, and had not stopped loving me while it was visible. I said, "I'm sorry." He said, "I know that too." The specificity of my father's love has always been in the economy of it, in the way he says the most with the fewest words, which is a quality I associate with the land and with the specific tradition of men who have worked the land for generations, who have learned from the land that most things do not need to be said, because what matters is the doing. My father said, "I know that too," and in those 4 words was everything I needed to know about whether I was still his daughter after what he did not know and what I had come close to doing. I want to tell you about the weeks after the bridge, because they were their own kind of territory and they belong in this account. I did not tell my father what I had been standing behind him on the bridge intending to do. I have not told him to this day. This is something I have sat with in the way that you sit with things you cannot undo and cannot fully disclose, understanding that some forms of honesty would serve the person telling more than the person being told, and that the damage of the full disclosure would not be repairable by the relief of the telling. I have told it in other contexts, in the context of this account, because the instruction I received from what happened on that bridge was to speak it, and I am obeying that instruction. What I told my father was enough for him to understand that I had not been well, and that I needed to change. What I told Patricia, in a conversation I requested, and that she agreed to with a generosity that I found difficult to receive, was more. I told her about the monitoring and the legal consultations and the calculated conversations with my father. I told her I had been trying to undermine their marriage. I told her I was sorry. She listened to all of it with the quality of attention I had noticed in her when I first met her, and dismissed as a performance of niceness. It was not a performance. She said she had known something was not right between us, and that she had been praying for me. I had to sit with that sentence for a moment. The specific weight of being told that someone I had been trying to harm had been praying for me. She said, "Your mother was a remarkable woman. I only met her once, but I understood why David loved her. I'm not trying to replace her. I don't think you can replace someone like that. I'm just here." I went home from that conversation, and I sat in the kitchen of my house in Woodstock, and I thought about the figure on the bridge. I had been thinking about it every day since it happened. Not with the anxiety I expected, but with the specific quality of attention you bring to something you know contains more than you have yet understood. I need to tell you something about my relationship to Jesus before the bridge, because it is important for what came after. I was a Jewish woman. Jesus was not absent from my awareness. I had grown up in a county that was predominantly Christian, and I had neighbors and friends and colleagues who believed in him. But he occupied a category in my mind that was labeled not ours, which is the category that many Jews hold for Jesus, not hostility, not dismissal, but the specific theological boundary that separates a tradition that sees him as a great teacher, or a historical figure from a tradition that sees him as the Messiah and the Son of God. I was on the not ours side of that boundary, and I had never had any particular occasion to examine it. What I had seen on the bridge did not fit the not ours category. I want to tell you about the process of crossing that boundary, because I think it is important, and because I think there are people watching this who are in a similar position, who have grown up inside a tradition that has its own understanding of Jesus, and who have never had a reason to examine that understanding until something happened to them that the existing understanding did not contain. The Jewish tradition's relationship to Jesus is complicated and layered, and I do not have the theological training to do it full justice. What I can tell you is what I understood and what I encountered. What I understood was that Jesus was a Jewish teacher who had been interpreted in ways that had sometimes been used over centuries of history to do harm to Jewish people, and that the Christian claim about him, that he was the Messiah and the Son of God, was not something my tradition accepted, and that this non-acceptance was not ignorance or stubborn refusal, but a considered theological position with a long history of serious engagement. I held that position not because I had examined it carefully myself, but because I had inherited it from the people who had examined it carefully, and because I had never had any particular reason to question what I had inherited. The bridge was the reason. Not in a simple sense, not in the sense of a vision overwhelming the traditions of my upbringing with a supernatural experience that bypassed reason, but in the sense that what I had seen on that bridge was something I could not account for within the framework I had, and that accounting for it required me to go somewhere I had not been. I went there with the same attention I brought to anything I needed to understand, which is carefully and without the pretense that I already knew what I would find. What I had seen on the bridge did not fit the not ours category. What I had seen on the bridge did not fit any category I had. It fit something else. Something that I spent the weeks after the bridge trying to locate in what I had been given by my tradition, and finding that my tradition had the language for it, even if not the specific figure. The language of a God who is present in the worst moment. The language of a God who sees you when you are at the furthest point from who you were made to be and does not look away. The language of a look that is entirely without condemnation. My tradition had that language. The Psalms had that language. The prophets had that language. And Jesus, whom I had put in the not ours category, was in that language. I began to understand, its fulfillment in a way I had not been given the tools to see before the bridge, because I had not been on the bridge. I read the Gospels for the first time in November 2024. Not as a theological exercise, not trying to resolve anything doctrinally, but because the figure I had seen on that bridge, and the words that had been available to describe him, all seemed to be pointing in one direction, and I followed the pointing. I read them the way I had read everything that mattered to me, which is carefully and with the willingness to be changed by what I found. I found what I found. The man who looked at people the way I had been looked at on the bridge. The man who went to the specific places of the worst things and did not require the people in those places to be anywhere other than exactly where they were. The man who looked at a woman caught in the middle of her worst moment and said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." Neither do I condemn you. That was what I had seen on the bridge. Not condemnation. Something that was the opposite of condemnation, which was a love so total and so specific that it could look at what I had been about to do and show it to me without judgment, while simultaneously communicating, without words, that the person being shown it was worth every effort it was going to take to reach her. I want to tell you about what the farm was like in the weeks after the bridge, because the farm is part of the story, and it had a different quality in those weeks than it had had in the 2 years before them. I had been working that land in the specific way of an obsessed person, which is to say I had been using it to stay near the object of the obsession, using it to justify the obsession, using it as evidence in the case I was building in my mind. The work had been real. I had not been faking the work. But underneath the work was a motivation that had contaminated it in a way I had not noticed, because contaminated motivation is difficult to see from the inside when the contamination has been present long enough to become the ambient condition. In the weeks after the bridge, the farm was different. I walked the fields in the mornings, and I felt the land in the way I had felt it as a child and as a young woman, before the obsession, which is to say I felt it as a gift rather than as a possession. The distinction between those two ways of experiencing a piece of land is the distinction between open hands and closed ones. Closed hands grip. Open hands receive. I had been gripping for 2 years, and my hands were tired, and in the weeks after the bridge they were beginning to open. My father came out to the farm twice in that first week, not to work, but to walk. He came on the Tuesday and on the Thursday, and he did not announce himself. He simply appeared at the barn at 6 in the morning, the way he had always appeared there for 40 years of his adult life. And we walked without saying much, and the walking was what was needed. On the Tuesday walk, I noticed that he was walking the fence line along the west field, which is the fence line that had been my mother's walking route on Sunday evenings. He did not say anything about this. He just walked it with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who knows every inch of what he is walking through and is not in a hurry to finish knowing it. I walked beside him. The early September light was on the ridges to the west, and the hay had been cut, and the fields had the specific smell of cut hay drying in the morning, which is one of the smells that is most completely my childhood. And I walked beside my father in that smell in the September light. And I was in the closest thing to prayer I had been in since the bridge. On the Thursday walk, he told me about Patricia. Not about their relationship, which I already knew, about who she was. He talked about her the way he talked about the farm, which was with the specific knowledge of someone who had paid close attention to something for long enough to understand it from the inside. He said she was steady, and that she had never tried to be my mother, and that she made him laugh in the evenings, which was something he had not had for 3 years. He said this last thing quietly, and with the specific quality of a man admitting something that he had been protecting from the risk of misunderstanding. He was telling me that he was happy. He was not asking for permission. He was giving me the information and trusting me to receive it. I received it. For the first time in 2 years, I received it without the filter of the obsession. My father came out to the farm twice in that first week, not to work, but to walk. He walked with me in the mornings the way he had walked with me since I was a child, side by side down the fence lines, pausing to look at the cattle, pausing to check the hay fields, not talking much. This was the specific language of the farm, the language that does not require words, because the things worth saying can be said by the quality of presence. I had learned this language before I had learned to read. I had forgotten it in the 2 years of obsession, and in the week after the bridge, I was learning it again. I want to tell you about the day I went back to the farm and talked to my father and Patricia together, because that day is part of what this story is about. It was in December. Patricia had put up a small Christmas tree in the living room of the farmhouse where I had grown up. My mother had never put up a Christmas tree, and the sight of it was its own small shock. But I had been practicing not organizing my responses to things around the inventory of what my mother would not have done. I sat in the kitchen where I had eaten 10,000 meals, and I talked to my father and Patricia about what I had been carrying for 2 years. The obsession, the legal maneuvering, the calculated conversations, the way I had let my grief for my mother turn into something that had been pointing itself at them. I did not tell them about the bridge. I told them everything else. My father cried. I had seen my father cry 3 times in my entire life, when his own father died, when his dog of 14 years died, and when my mother died. He cried in the kitchen of the farmhouse, and Patricia put her hand on his arm, and I sat across the table from both of them and said what I needed to say. Patricia left the kitchen while I spoke, not from discomfort, but from understanding that what my father and I needed to do first was between the 2 of us. She went to the garden, and I could see her through the kitchen window, tending the beds, giving us the room we needed. I was aware of her out there while I talked, and the awareness was not the old awareness, the monitoring awareness of a woman cataloging the presence of an intruder. It was the awareness of someone who understood that the person in the garden was also part of what I was trying to restore, and that the restoring required me to begin with my father and move outward. My father cried. I have said this already. I want to say it again because the crying mattered. He is not a man who cries easily, my father, which is the quality of a man who has learned from the land and from his tradition to hold things without demonstrating them. And when he cried, it was not from what I had done, which he did not fully know, but from the recognition of what I had lost and what it had cost me. The grief for my mother that had never been properly grieved. The isolation of 2 years of carrying something too heavy to carry without help. The specific exhaustion of a daughter who had tried to love him wrongly and was now trying to find the right way. He said afterward, when the crying was done, and the kitchen had the specific quality of a room where something important has been resolved. Sarah, this farm will be yours. It was always going to be yours. I changed the will when I married Patricia because the law requires certain arrangements, but your portion was never in question. You are my child. This land has your hands in it as much as mine. I want to tell you what I felt when he said that. Not relief. Something more complicated than relief. Because the farm was what the obsession had been aimed at, and hearing him say that the farm was mine should have been a resolution. And it was not a resolution because by December, the farm had stopped being the point. The farm had been a container for the grief, and for the loss, and for the specific distorted inheritance logic of a daughter who had watched her father replace her mother. The container was emptied when I went down on the bridge. What was left was the grief itself, without the container, and the grief itself was something I had been running from since September 2021 and had finally stopped running from. I was talking to someone from a small Mennonite congregation in the valley who had heard through a mutual friend that I had been asking questions about Christianity. Her name was Anna. She was 60 years old, a farmer herself, a woman who moved through the world with the specific groundedness that long experience of both faith and agricultural work produces. We met twice before I told her about the bridge. When I told her, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That sounds like a man who already knows you." That was the sentence that found me. That sounds like a man who already knows you, not a man who judged you, or evaluated you, or decided about you based on what you were about to do. A man who already knew you, who had known you before you were standing on the bridge, who had been there for the grief and the obsession and the 2 years of cold, calculated damage, not watching from a distance, but present in the way that people are present when they know you and have not left. I want to tell you about the conversation with Anna before I tell you about the baptism, because the conversation was its own significant event. Anna was the woman from the Mennonite congregation. I had found her through a mutual connection, a farmer who attended her congregation and who had mentioned her to me when I said I had been asking questions about Christianity. The Mennonite tradition was not the tradition I would have predicted for myself if I had been predicting. But the valley had a Mennonite community that had been farming in it for generations, and the specific combination of agricultural grounding and unpretentious faith that I found in that community was, I realized when I encountered it, something I recognized. It was adjacent to the theological sensibility my father had expressed in the way he walked the fields. It was familiar in its unfamiliarity. Anna was 60 years old and had grown up on a farm in Page County and had been in that congregation her entire life, and had the specific quality of a person who has been attending carefully to the same things for a long time and has developed a knowledge of them that is deep rather than wide. She was not an intellectual in the theological sense. She was a practitioner, which was a different and in some ways more useful kind of knowing for where I was. She had what I was looking for, which was someone who could sit with the bridge without immediately trying to categorize it. I had told the story to 2 other people before Anna, and both of them had tried to put it in a framework, one in the framework of grief-induced hallucination, which was kindly meant but was not honest with itself about what I had described, and one in the framework of a dramatic supernatural encounter that called for an immediate declaration of faith, which was generous, but was moving faster than I was capable of moving. Anna listened to the whole account, and was quiet afterward, and then said, "That sounds like a man who already knows you." She did not press. She did not require me to draw conclusions I was not ready to draw. She said, "Take your time with this. The Shenandoah has been here a long time. What you found in it will still be there when you are ready." That sentence mattered more than I can fully explain. I had been in a state of urgency for 2 years. The obsession had a temporal quality to it, the quality of something that needed to be acted on before the window closed, before the will was signed or the property transferred or the marriage solidified beyond the point where I could still affect the outcome. Urgency had been the atmosphere I had been breathing. Anna's sentence was the opposite of urgency. It was patience, the specific patience of someone who has lived alongside the same river for 60 years and understands that rivers are not in a hurry, and that what the river gives it gives in its own time and cannot be rushed. I went to the Sunday evening gatherings for 3 weeks before I said anything in them. I sat in the folding chairs in the community center in Luray, and I listened to the singing and to the simple service, and I felt the specific quality of a place that had been held together by people who came back to it, without making it dramatic, week after week, year after year, the accumulation of faithful attendance building something that was more than any single gathering, but that was only ever present in the individual gathering. I found it restful, in a way I had not expected to find anything restful, after 2 years of sustained unrest. On the 4th Sunday, I sang one of the hymns. I did not know all the words, and I sang the ones I knew, and I allowed the shape of the melody to carry me through the ones I did not. Anna, who was in the row ahead of me, turned around at the end of the service and smiled at me in the specific way of someone who has been watching for a small thing and has seen it arrive. She did not press. She did not require me to draw conclusions I was not ready to draw. She said, "Take your time with this. The Shenandoah has been here a long time. What you found in it will still be there when you are ready." I was baptized in the Shenandoah River in April 2025, 6 months after the bridge. My father was on the bank. Patricia was beside him. Anna was the one who took me under the water. I came up in the specific quality of early April light on the Shenandoah, and I stood in the river that I had grown up beside, and I understood that the tradition I had been raised in, and the faith I was now entering, were not the contradiction I had expected them to be. The God of the Psalms and the God of the Gospels were not 2 different gods. I had been given the first language of that God my entire life. I had received the second language on a bridge in September. I work the farm every day. I walk those fields and I know them the way I have known them since I was a child, with the knowledge that goes into the body rather than the mind, the knowledge that is about belonging to a place rather than possessing it. I know now that what I thought I was protecting when I was on that bridge was not the farm. The farm was never at risk from Patricia. What was at risk was the thing I had confused with the farm, which was my mother. I was trying to protect my mother from being replaced, and my mother could not be replaced, and Patricia was not replacing her. And the clarity of that, which I could not see for 2 years, came to me in a look from the other end of a bridge. My mother would have been glad for my father. He told me she said so. I believe him. I believe her. And I believe now, in a way that is not comfortable or neat or resolved at every edge, that she is somewhere that is not gone, that she is known by the same man who looked at me on the bridge, that the loss that initiated all of this is not what I thought it was, which was a permanent and final ending. It was something I do not have full language for yet. I am still learning the language. I want to tell you something about the harvest gathering this past September, because it belongs here. My mother organized the Shenandoah Valley Jewish Community's harvest gathering for 22 years. She died before the 2021 gathering, which she had been planning when she got sick. For 3 years after her death, no one organized it. It simply did not happen, the way things do not happen when the person who held them together is gone, and no one else has yet understood that the holding needs to continue. In the summer of 2025, Patricia asked my father if the gathering was something that should come back. She had never attended it. She had no connection to it. She asked because she had heard my father talk about it and understood from the way he talked about it that it mattered. My father brought the question to me. I organized the gathering in October 2025. Not the same, not exactly. I do not have my mother's specific genius for making people feel seen in a room, but present. 43 people came, some who had attended every year for decades, some who had not been since my mother's last gathering, some who were new to the valley and had never attended before. We were on the farm, in the field below the house where my mother had always held it, with the Blue Ridge in the distance, doing what it does in October, which is turn colors that seem impossible from a distance, and are real when you are standing in them. Patricia stood at the edge of the gathering with my father, and she did not try to be anything other than what she was, which was the woman who had asked the question that brought it back. I stood in the middle of it and led the first blessing in the specific Hebrew that my mother had taught me, and I felt her in every word of it, not as a loss, but as a presence. The way the living presence of people we have loved persists in the forms they gave us. I am a woman of two inheritances now. The tradition I was given by birth, and the faith I received on a bridge. I do not experience these as contradictions. The Shenandoah Valley holds them both. My mother held them before me in ways I did not have the language to recognize until I crossed from one to the other and looked back. The farm is mine in the way it was always mine, which is not in the legal sense, but in the sense that my hands are in the soil, and my life is organized around the rhythm of it, and it will carry my work forward when I am gone the way it carried my father's work and his father's work. Patricia tends the garden that was my mother's garden, and she tends it with care. And she has added things my mother never planted and left unchanged, the things my mother loved, and the garden is both of them now, which is not a loss, but an addition. I stood behind my father on a bridge in September, and I did not push him. And the reason I did not push him is standing on the other end of that bridge in my memory every day when I walk out to the fields before sunrise. I see that look every morning. I try to let it be what it is, which is the specific and undeserved and complete love of a man who already knew me, who knew what I was about to do, who came to the worst moment of my worst self and showed me myself without condemnation and waited for me to put my hands down. He was there. He had always been there. I just had not been looking in the right direction. If this story reached something in you today, I want to ask you for one thing. Leave a comment with 4 words. He already knew me. Let those 4 words be the beginning of something. Because wherever you are, and whatever you have been building in your own mind, that has the weight and the logic and the internal justification of the thing I was building, he already knows. He has been there the whole time, and he is not looking at you the way you are looking at yourself. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell. Share this with someone who is carrying something they have not been able to put down. Someone whose grief has found the wrong container. Someone who needs to know that the man on the bridge is already on their bridge too. And if you have your own story, a moment when you saw yourself from the outside and understood what you were about to become, leave it in the comments. I read everyone. May Jesus walk with you today and in every day that is still ahead of you. Amen. I want to close by telling you about something my mother said to me when she was sick. Something she said in the specific context of her own impending death that I did not understand at the time, and that I understand differently now. We were sitting on the porch of the farmhouse in August 2021, a month before she died. She was tired in the way of someone who has been sick for a long time, and whose body has reached an accommodation with the tiredness, not fighting it anymore, but living alongside it. She looked at the fields, the late summer hay fields golden in the afternoon, and she said, "All of this is passing through us, not ours. Passing through. We are how it gets from one time to the next." I had understood her to be talking about the land. The land passes from generation to generation, and we are the vessels of its passage. That is a true thing, and she was saying a true thing. But sitting on the bridge 4 years later, going down on my knees in front of the figure who was looking at me without condemnation, I understood that she had also been talking about something else. About the love that passes through us. About the grief that passes through us. About the God who is in the passing, not standing outside the river watching it flow, but in it, moving through the same seasons, and the same losses, and the same moments of terrible clarity that we move through, present in the way that water is present in a field, not separate from the land, but the thing that makes the land what it is. All of this is passing through us. Not ours. Passing through. I am how my mother's love gets from her time to the next time. I am how the grief and the farm and the tradition and the harvest gathering and the open hands get from where she was to where I am, and from where I am to wherever comes next. That is my inheritance. Not the acreage or the cattle or the hay operation, the passing through. He already knew me. He knows you too. That is what I want to leave you with. Whatever you are carrying, and however far you have carried it, and whatever it has made you consider in the worst hours, he already knows it, and he is at the end of your bridge. He was there on mine. He will be there on yours. One more thing. About my mother's garden. Patricia has been tending it for 3 years now. She has kept the things my mother planted that were established and thriving. The climbing roses along the fence, the lavender beds, the kitchen herb garden in the raised beds my father built. She has added things my mother never planted. A section of cut flowers that she brings into the house and that fills the farmhouse kitchen with a quality of color and scent that was not there when I was growing up. She has her own aesthetic, Patricia, which is different from my mother's and not better or worse, just different, which is what a garden is when the hands tending it are different hands. I sat in the garden with Patricia in July, in the chair that was my mother's chair, and I told her what my mother had said about her after the harvest gathering. I had been carrying that piece of information since my father told me in the car, and I had been deciding who it belonged to, and I had decided it belonged to Patricia. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "She sounds like someone I would have wanted to know much longer." I said, "She would have wanted to know you too." I meant it. It is the truest thing I have said in 2 years. He already knew me. He knows you. The inheritance was never the land. The inheritance was this: the garden and the chair and the October light on the Shenandoah Valley, and a woman who plants cut flowers, and a father who still walks the fields, and a figure at the end of a bridge who showed me what I was about to lose before it was too late to stop. He already knew me.